I went winter camping alone in late January of 2016, when I was 29. I had done cold weather trips before, but never this deep into the season and never this far from any maintained area. The place was a stretch of public forest in the northern Midwest, several miles from the nearest plowed road. The land was flat in some areas and broken in others, with frozen creeks, thick pine stands, and long open sections where the wind had nothing to slow it down. I picked the spot because it looked quiet on the map and because I wanted a few days with no noise, no phones, and no people. The drive itself should have warned me. Snow had been falling for days, not heavy, just steady. The sky stayed gray the entire way, and the sun never showed. By the time I parked at the end of the forest access road, my tires were packed with ice, and the engine ticked loudly as it cooled. The air burned my lungs the moment I stepped out. The cold felt sharp, like it had weight to it. I loaded my pack, locked the truck, and started walking in. The snow was knee-deep in places, crusted over just enough to break with every step. Each footfall made a dull, cracking sound that echoed through the trees. The forest felt empty in a way that made me aware of my own breathing. No birds, no wind at first, just the sound of my boots and the slow drag of my gear sled behind me. I followed an old logging path that was barely visible, marked only by wider gaps between trees. After about 2 hours, I found a small clearing near a frozen creek and decided to make camp there. The trees were dense enough to block some wind, and there was plenty of dead wood around. Setting up took longer than it should have because my fingers kept going numb even through gloves. I had to keep stopping to flex them and shove them under my arms. The tent finally went up, stiff and loud as the frozen fabric snapped into place. The ground was hard as stone, and every stake took real effort. As evening came, the temperature dropped fast. The gray sky darkened into a heavy blue, and the shadows between the trees stretched out. I gathered wood until my shoulders burned, then started a fire. The flames looked weak in the open cold, but the heat felt good on my face. I ate a simple meal and melted snow for water, keeping my movements slow and careful to save energy. Everything felt normal, just quiet and cold. The first strange thing I noticed was the silence later that night. Not the peaceful kind, but a dead silence that felt thick. Even the wind stopped. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening, expecting the forest to come back to life in small ways, but nothing did. It felt like the land was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the weather and tried to sleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke up suddenly. I did not know why at first. My heart was already racing. The cold pressed in from every side, and my breath fogged the inside of the tent. I lay still, listening. That was when I heard it, a slow, uneven crunch in the snow somewhere beyond the trees. It was not rhythmic like an animal moving on 4 legs. It sounded heavy and careful, with pauses between each step. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark fabric inches from my face. The sound stopped. I waited, counting my breaths. Then it started again, closer this time. I told myself it could be a deer moving strangely on ice or maybe branches settling, but my body did not believe it. The noise circled part of the clearing and then faded away. I did not sleep again after that. Morning came pale and weak. The sky was still gray, and the air felt even colder. When I stepped outside, I saw tracks near the edge of the clearing. They were not animal tracks. The prints were wide and deep, with clear heel marks and uneven spacing, like someone walking slowly and carefully. The snow inside the prints was compressed and slightly darker. They went around part of my camp and then back into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring. I knew no one should be out there. There were no nearby trails, no cabins, nothing. I felt exposed in a way I had never felt before. I packed my things tighter than planned and decided to move deeper, thinking it might just be someone passing through. I told myself leaving the area could solve it. Traveling that day was harder. The wind picked up, cutting through my layers. The sky started dropping fine snow again, the kind that stings your eyes. My muscles felt heavy, and every step took effort. I followed the frozen creek upstream, using it as a guide. The land became more uneven, with fallen trees and thick brush buried under snow. Around midday, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. I saw more tracks crossing the creek ahead of me. They were fresh, edges sharp, not filled in by falling snow. They matched the ones from my camp. Whoever made them was ahead of me now, moving in the same direction. I did not see anyone. I did not hear anything, just the tracks and the quiet. The forest felt tighter, like the trees were closing in. I kept moving, telling myself not to panic, but my pace increased without me meaning to. My breath came harder, and sweat formed under my layers, which only made the cold worse when I stopped. By late afternoon, the light started to fade again. I found a spot between two rocky rises that blocked some wind and set up camp quickly. My hands shook as I worked, partly from cold and partly from fear. I built the fire bigger this time, feeding it constantly. The flames snapped and popped, sending sparks into the darkening air. As night fell, the wind howled through the trees, but underneath it, I heard movement again. Slow, deliberate, not circling this time, but approaching. The sound stopped just outside the firelight. I stayed near the flames, staring into the dark. My senses felt stretched thin. I smelled something faint and sour on the wind, like unwashed clothes and smoke. The movement did not come closer. It stayed there for a long time, long enough for my legs to cramp from standing still. Eventually, the sounds faded, swallowed by the wind. I stayed awake the entire night, feeding the fire, watching the shadows. When morning came, the fire had burned low, and the cold felt brutal. I found more tracks around the camp. They were closer this time, cutting between the rocks. One set came within a few feet of where I had been standing. I saw drag marks too, like something heavy had been pulled along the snow for a short distance. That was when I decided to leave completely. I did not care about finishing the trip. I did not care about the effort. I packed fast, hands numb and clumsy, and started back the way I came, even though it meant fighting the wind head-on. The walk back felt endless. Snow picked up again, thick and blinding. The forest blurred into shapes and shadows. I kept checking behind me, my neck stiff from tension. Several times, I thought I heard footsteps matching my pace, but when I stopped, there was nothing. The tracks behind me filled quickly with new snow, erasing evidence. As the light faded for the third time, I saw the faint outline of the logging road through the trees. Relief hit me so hard my knees almost gave out. I pushed on, ignoring the pain in my legs and the burning in my lungs. When I reached my truck, it was half buried in snow, but it was there, solid and real. I unlocked it with shaking hands and got inside. The cab smelled like oil and old fabric, familiar and safe. I started the engine and let it idle, watching my breath fog the windshield. I did not look back into the forest. I drove out slowly, tires slipping on ice, not stopping until I reached the main road. Only then did I pull over and breathe normally again. My hands ached as they warmed, and my whole body shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. Weeks later, after the trip, I read about a man who had been living off the land illegally in that area, moving camps, avoiding roads, surviving through winter by stealing supplies from hunters and campers. He had been arrested not long after my trip, found less than 10 miles from where I had been. The thought of how close he had come still sits heavy with me. When I remember that silence, those tracks, and the way the forest felt watched, I know how easily things could have gone wrong. I do not camp alone in winter anymore. I do not ignore that feeling in my gut. I made it out because I left when I did, and because whatever was out there chose not to step into the firelight. I still remember that trip because it was the last time I ever agreed to be around my ex-wife and her mother in the middle of nowhere. It was late September of 2016, early fall, when the nights get long fast and the air starts to smell like wet leaves and cold dirt. The location was a remote public camping area near a river valley in northern Idaho. Far from towns, far from cell service, and far from anything that felt safe once the sun went down. I was 36 at the time. My ex-wife, Laura, was 34. Her mother, Marlene, was in her early 60s. We were divorced already, but paperwork and shared history kept pulling us into the same space. The camping trip was supposed to be practical. We needed to clear out some old storage items from a property nearby, and camping was cheaper than a motel. That was the excuse. Deep down, I already knew it was a bad idea. The campground was mostly empty when we arrived. Just a few scattered sites, each spaced far apart by thick trees and brush. Tall pines blocked the sky, and the ground was soft with old needles and mud from recent rain. The river ran somewhere below the campground, loud enough that you could hear it at night but not close enough to see it. The sound never stopped. It rushed and crashed in the dark like something breathing. We set up camp in silence. I pitched the tent while they unloaded gear. No one looked relaxed. The air felt heavy, like pressure before a storm. The sky stayed gray all afternoon, and the light faded earlier than expected. By the time everything was set, it already felt like evening. The first night felt wrong from the start. The temperature dropped fast, and the damp air soaked into everything. My jacket smelled like old smoke and mildew. The forest felt crowded even though there was nothing moving. No birds, no wind, just that river noise and the occasional creak of trees rubbing together. I kept noticing small things. Footprints near our site that didn't match our boots. Trash half buried in the dirt, old enough to be faded and torn. A fire ring nearby with blackened rocks but no recent ash. It looked like people had been there recently but left in a hurry. Laura seemed on edge. She kept scanning the tree line and checking her phone even though there was no signal. Her mother stayed quiet, sitting stiff near the fire pit, staring into the woods like she was listening for something. I tried to ignore it and told myself it was just the place getting to me. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The tent felt too thin, like paper. Every sound felt close. Branches snapping somewhere deeper in the woods. Heavy steps that stopped as soon as I focused on them. I told myself it was animals, maybe elk or deer, but the steps sounded slow and deliberate. At some point in the night, I woke up with the strong feeling that someone was nearby, not watching from far away but close. The kind of feeling you get when someone is standing just out of sight. I stayed still, listening. The river kept roaring. My heart beat so loud I was sure it would give me away if anyone was there. By morning, my body felt tense and sore. The forest looked normal again in daylight, but the unease didn't fade. While gathering firewood later that day, I found something that made my stomach drop. A strip of cloth tied around a tree branch about shoulder height. It was faded red, torn, and knotted tight. It wasn't trail marking tape. It looked personal, like part of clothing. I didn't touch it. I just stood there for a long moment, listening. The woods felt quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. The second night was worse. Clouds rolled in, and a light rain started after dark. The fire wouldn't stay lit. Smoke clung low to the ground and burned my eyes. The shadows between the trees looked deeper, thicker. The river sounded louder, angrier. Sometime after midnight, I heard movement close to camp. Not running, not walking away. Slow steps circling. Leaves crunching carefully, like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to make noise. My breathing slowed as I listened. The sound moved behind the tent, then stopped. I waited for it to pass. Didn't. Then I heard fabric brush against fabric. The soft sound of something touching the side of the tent. I stayed frozen, staring into the dark. The rain masked everything else. I could feel my pulse in my ears. After a long moment, the pressure on the tent eased. The steps moved away, slow and controlled, disappearing back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. The first light, we packed up faster than planned. No one said anything, but the tension was obvious. While loading the truck, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud leading away from our site toward the river. They weren't there the day before. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Before we could leave, something else happened. Marlene slipped near the edge of the slope leading down toward the river. The ground was slick, and she lost her footing. She didn't fall far, but she twisted badly and couldn't put weight on her leg. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it made leaving difficult. The nearest help was miles away. While trying to assess the situation, I noticed movement across the clearing. Someone standing between the trees. Not close enough to see clearly, but close enough to know it was a person. They didn't wave. They didn't step forward. They just stood there watching. Then they slowly backed away into the trees. That was when the reality of it hit me. We weren't alone out there. We hadn't been alone at any point. I didn't waste time. I loaded what I could and used the truck radio to reach emergency services once we drove far enough to get signal. Took hours for help to arrive. During that time, I kept scanning the woods, half expecting to see that shape again. I never did, but the feeling of being watched never left. When authorities finally came and took over, they searched the surrounding area. They found an abandoned camp deeper in the forest. Old food cans, tarp, boots. The place looked lived in, not temporary. There were paths worn into the dirt that led toward our campsite. They didn't find the person who had been there. The official explanation was that it was likely a transient living in the woods, someone avoiding contact. No direct threat, they said, just bad luck. But that explanation never sat right with me, because weeks later, after the trip was over and life moved on, I looked up reports from that area. Missing hikers, unexplained disappearances, people who went into the woods and never came back. The dates lined up too closely to ignore. The ending of that story is simple and clear. We left and never returned. Laura and I stopped all unnecessary contact after that. Her mother recovered, but she never went camping again. As for me, I don't camp anymore. Not in places where help is far away and trees block the sky. Some places feel empty, but they're not. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't something supernatural or impossible. It's the quiet understanding that someone real, desperate, and unseen was close enough to touch the walls around you, and you were only saved because morning came when it did. I went camping with my dog in late October of 2014, back when I was 32 and still thought being alone in the woods was the best way to clear my head. I picked a stretch of national forest in the northern part of Michigan, far from any campgrounds or marked trails. It was the kind of place where the roads slowly turned from gravel into dirt, then into nothing at all. The trees were thick and tall, mostly pine and birch, and the ground was soft with years of needles and wet leaves. The air smelled cold and metallic, like rain that had already passed and might come back. My dog was a 4-year-old German Shepherd mix named Lark. He was calm, alert, and the kind of dog that watched everything without making noise. I trusted him more than I trusted any weapon. He stayed close to my knee when we walked, his nails clicking softly on rocks, his nose always moving. That alone made me feel safer than I probably should have. I parked my old truck near a dry creek bed, hidden enough that you would not notice it unless you were already looking for it. I carried my pack, food, and tent about half a mile into the trees. I wanted distance from the road, but not so much that I could not leave fast if I needed to. The ground sloped slightly downward, and there was a clearing just big enough for a small tent. Broken branches lay scattered around, old and gray, snapped by storms years before. Nothing looked fresh or disturbed. I set up camp slowly, taking my time. The forest was quiet in a heavy way. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my breathing and Lark's movement. That kind of quiet always felt normal to me at first. I told myself it meant no one else was around. I told myself a lot of things. As the sun dropped, the temperature fell fast. I made a small fire using fallen wood, careful not to let it get too big. Lark lay near the edge of the clearing, facing the trees, not the fire. His ears stayed upright, and he shifted positions often. I noticed it, but I did not think much of it. Dogs notice everything. That was his job. When it got fully dark, the woods changed. The black between the trees felt thicker, like it pressed closer. My fire only lit a small circle, and beyond that was nothing but shadow. I ate a simple meal, then put out the fire completely. I never liked sleeping with a fire going. Light makes you visible. Darkness hides you. Inside the tent, the sounds became clearer. Leaves scraping, branches creaking, something small running through brush. All of it normal, all of it familiar. Lark stayed just outside the tent opening, his body blocking most of it. I could feel him there, warm and solid. Sometime after midnight, I woke up for no clear reason. The air felt wrong, heavy. Lark was standing now, stiff, facing the trees. His body was tight, tail low, ears forward. He was not growling or barking. That scared me more than noise ever could. He only did that when he was trying not to be noticed. I listened harder. First, I heard nothing. Then I noticed a sound that did not belong. Slow movement, not an animal's quick steps, not wind. It was steady, uneven, like someone shifting weight carefully. The sound came from the left side of the clearing, just beyond where the fire had been. I stayed still. My breathing felt loud in my chest. Lark took one step forward, then stopped. His muscles were tense enough that I could see them even in the low light. Whatever was out there was close enough that he could smell it. The movement stopped. The silence that followed felt deliberate, too controlled. Animals do not freeze like that unless they are scared or hunting. This felt different. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time stretched in a way that made everything feel unreal. Then the sound started again, closer this time. I heard leaves compress under weight. Not 4 legs, 2. Careful, slow, trying to stay quiet. Lark shifted sideways, putting himself between the sound and the tent. A low sound came from his chest, not loud enough to echo, but enough to warn. The movement stopped again. I reached for my flashlight, but I did not turn it on. I knew better. Light would tell whoever it was exactly where I was. Instead, I watched the dark, staring so hard my eyes burned. Shapes started to form that I knew were not real, but one shape did not fade. Something stood at the edge of the clearing. I could not see details, only a darker shape against dark trees. It did not move. It did not step forward or back. It just stood there. Lark's hackles rose. His body shook slightly, not from fear, but from restraint. He wanted to move. He wanted to act. The shape shifted its weight. A foot scraped against stone. The sound was quiet, but clear enough to remove all doubt. This was a person. My thoughts raced, but my body stayed still. I did not know if this person had seen the truck. I did not know if they had been watching for a while. I did not know if they were armed. I knew only that no one ends up that deep in the forest by accident at that hour. The person took a slow step forward, then another. Each step was measured. Lark let out a sharper sound, louder this time, breaking the stillness. The figure stopped instantly. Seconds passed. Then the person stepped back, just one step. Then another. Leaves rustled as they retreated into the trees. Not running, not rushing, just leaving. I waited a long time after the sound faded. Lark stayed standing, watching the same spot. I did not relax until the sky started to lighten slightly with early morning gray. I did not sleep again. To first light, I packed everything fast. My hands shook and I dropped things more than once. Lark stayed close, scanning the woods constantly. I felt watched the entire time, even though I saw nothing. As I walked back toward the truck, I noticed something I had missed the day before. About 50 yards from my campsite, behind a thick cluster of trees, the ground was flattened. Leaves crushed down in a wide oval shape. Someone had been standing there for a long time, watching. There were footprints too. Boot prints, not old, not weathered. Fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. I followed the prints for a short distance before I stopped myself. They led away from my camp, deeper into the woods. I had no reason to follow them. Curiosity is what gets people hurt. When I reached the truck, nothing looked disturbed. No broken windows, no marks. I loaded my gear and drove away without stopping, my eyes glued to the mirrors. I did not go back to that forest again. Months later, I read about a man arrested in a nearby county. He had been living off the grid, moving through forests, watching campsites, stealing supplies. Some people had reported feeling watched. Others had found signs of someone being close while they slept. No one had been killed, but the details were close enough to make my stomach turn. I still camp. I still go into the woods. But I do not go alone anymore, and I do not ignore my dog when he tells me something is wrong. That night did not end with violence or blood, but it changed how I see quiet places. The forest did nothing wrong. It was just big enough to hide someone who was waiting for the wrong moment. That was enough. I have spent most of my life working in the woods, so being alone out there never bothered me. I learned early how to read the ground, how to smell weather coming, how to tell the difference between an animal trail and a human one just by the way the brush is bent. In the fall of 2014, when I was 38 years old, I took a short break from contract work and decided to camp for a few nights in a stretch of forest I knew well in the northern part of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It was a mixed forest of pine, maple, and birch, cut through by old logging roads that were no longer on any map. I had worked that land years earlier, marking trees and helping clear blowdowns after storms. It felt familiar, like visiting an old job site. I parked my truck at the end of a washed-out road and hiked in with my pack just before sunset. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold dirt. The ground was soft from recent rain, and every step made a dull sound, like walking on a soaked sponge. I set my camp near a small rise, not far from a creek that moved slow and dark between the trees. I pitched my tent carefully, checked the ground for roots and stones, and made a small cooking spot with rocks I dragged in from the creek bed. Everything felt normal. Too normal, maybe, but I did not think much of it at the time. That first night passed without trouble. I slept light, as I always do outside, waking now and then to the sound of wind moving through the tops of the trees. In the morning, I brewed coffee and walked the area, checking the old roads and trails. I noticed fresh tracks that did not belong to any deer or bear. They were boot prints, deep and clean, made by someone wearing heavy tread. That was not strange by itself. Hunters and hikers sometimes wandered through even that far out. What caught my attention was how many times the tracks crossed the same stretch of ground, as if someone had been pacing back and forth. I told myself it was nothing and went on with my day. I fished the creek, cleaned a few small trout, and spent the afternoon cutting deadfall for firewood. As the light started to fade, I noticed something else that made me pause. A few branches near my camp had been snapped low to the ground. They were not broken by wind or animals. The breaks were clean, deliberate. Someone had been there while I was gone. That night, the forest felt different. The usual sounds were still there, but they felt farther away, muted. I lay in my tent listening to every small noise. At some point after midnight, I heard footsteps. They were slow and heavy, not the quick steps of an animal. They circled my camp once, crunching softly on leaves and twigs. I stayed still, barely breathing, my hand wrapped around the handle of my knife. The steps stopped near my fire ring, close enough that I could smell damp earth being disturbed. After a long time, they moved away, fading back into the dark. I did not sleep much after that. The next morning, I found clear signs that someone had been standing just outside my tent. The ground was pressed down, and there were cigarette butts crushed into the soil. I do not smoke, and I had not seen anyone else since arriving. The feeling in my stomach was heavy and cold. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but pride and stubbornness got the better of me. I told myself it was likely another woodsman or a hunter passing through, maybe curious. Still, I moved my camp a short distance uphill, closer to thicker trees where I could see less but hear more. That afternoon, while gathering more firewood, I found an old shack about half a mile from my camp. It was built from rough boards and rusted sheet metal, barely standing. Inside, there were signs that someone had been living there recently. A sleeping bag, stained and worn. Empty food cans stacked in one corner. A crude table made from a stump. What disturbed me most was a pile of items that did not belong to one person. Different boots, mismatched gloves, torn packs. Things people do not usually abandon unless something goes wrong. I left the shack quickly and headed back toward my camp, watching the trees the entire way. I kept feeling like I was being watched. Not in a dramatic way, just the quiet pressure of eyes on my back. When I reached my camp, I found my pack moved. Not opened or stolen, just turned slightly, like someone had checked its weight. That night was worse. The footsteps returned, closer this time. They did not circle. They stopped near my tent and stayed there. I could hear breathing, slow and rough. I could hear the faint scrape of something metal against stone. I stayed silent, every muscle tight, counting my breaths. After what felt like hours, the sound moved away again. I did not sleep at all. At first light, I packed everything as fast as I could without making noise. I left food behind to lighten my load and took only what I needed. As I started hiking back toward my truck, I noticed more signs on the trail. Broken branches at shoulder height, scratches on tree bark that looked intentional. The boot prints were everywhere now, overlapping mine, sometimes stepping directly into my tracks. Halfway out, I heard movement ahead of me. Not footsteps this time, but the sound of someone dragging something heavy through leaves. I veered off the trail and moved through thick brush, keeping low. From behind a fallen log, I saw the shack again, closer than it should have been. Near it was a shallow pit covered loosely with branches and dirt. A piece of fabric stuck out, stained dark and stiff. I did not go closer. I did not need to. I moved as quietly and quickly as I could, taking longer routes, avoiding open areas. My heart hammered the entire way. When I finally reached the washed-out road and saw my truck, I felt weak with relief. The relief did not last. My driver's side door had fresh scratches around the lock, and the dust on the hood was disturbed. Someone had been there, waiting, maybe watching the road. I did not stop to think. I got in, started the engine, and drove out fast, not slowing until I reached pavement. I went straight to the nearest ranger station and reported what I had seen. They took my statement seriously, more seriously than I expected. A week later, I learned they found the shack and the pit. There were remains inside, enough to confirm at least 2 missing persons from previous years. The man responsible was never officially identified. They believed he moved on deeper into the forest or crossed into another region. I never went back to that stretch of woods. I still work outdoors, but I am more careful now. I trust my instincts sooner. The forest itself was not the scary part. It was quiet, patient, and honest. What scared me was knowing how easy it is for someone to disappear out there, and how thin the line is between solitude and danger. I left those woods alive because I listened to the signs and because I chose to leave when I still could. That decision is the reason I am here to tell this story, and it is one I will never forget. I went on that hunting trip because I needed to get away from everything. It was late October of 2014, and I was 32 years old. I had taken a week off work and drove alone to a remote stretch of public land in northern Idaho, far from towns and paved roads. It was a place I had never hunted before, but I liked that. The maps showed miles of forest, old logging roads, and deep cuts in the land where rivers and creeks ran cold and fast. I wanted quiet, isolation, and enough space to think without running into other people. I parked my truck at the end of a washed-out dirt road just before sunset. The air was sharp and smelled like wet leaves and pine sap. The sky was already turning gray, and the trees blocked most of the remaining light. I unloaded my gear slowly, making sure I had everything: rifle, pack, tent, sleeping bag, food, headlamp, extra batteries, knife, first aid kit. I checked my phone once before losing signal completely. No bars. I expected that. I hiked about a mile off the road before setting up camp. I chose a small flat area near a creek, surrounded by tall trees. The ground was damp, and my boots sank slightly into the soil as I walked. I could hear the creek moving steadily, a low, constant sound that filled the silence. I set up my tent, stacked some firewood, and ate a simple meal from a metal cup. As night came in fully, the forest felt heavy and closed in. The darkness between the trees was thick, almost solid. That first night passed without anything strange happening. I slept lightly, waking often to small noises: branches snapping, leaves shifting, the creek rising and falling. All normal sounds. In the morning, the cold was biting. My breath came out in white clouds, and frost covered the tent. I made coffee and sat quietly, listening. Somewhere far off, I heard an animal moving, slow and heavy. I packed my rifle and moved uphill, following an old game trail. The days followed a routine. I woke early, hunted until midday, returned to camp, rested, then went out again in the afternoon. I saw signs of deer, tracks, droppings, scraped bark, but I never saw the animals themselves. That was not unusual, but something about the place felt wrong after the second day. It was subtle at first, a feeling of being watched, even when I stood completely still. I would stop and listen, and everything would go quiet. Birds would stop calling. The forest would feel empty, like it was holding its breath. On the third day, I found boot prints near my camp. At first, I told myself they had to be mine, but when I looked closer, they were larger than my boots and headed toward the creek, not away from it. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the mud. Someone had been there while I was gone. I felt a tightness in my chest. This land was public, so it was possible another hunter had passed through. But there were no vehicles on the road when I arrived, and I had not heard or seen anyone since. I packed up my camp a little tighter that night. I moved my food higher into the trees and made sure my rifle was clean and loaded. Sleep came slowly. I kept waking to the sound of footsteps in the distance. Slow, uneven steps, stopping and starting. Each time I listened closely, the sound faded. I told myself it was an animal. Elk or moose can sound heavy when they move. Still, my body stayed tense until morning. The fourth day brought fog. Thick, low fog that rolled through the trees and made everything damp. Visibility was poor. I decided to stay closer to camp and hunt along the ridge above the creek. As I moved through the fog, I noticed something else. Broken branches that were snapped high off the ground, higher than a deer could reach. Scratches on tree trunks that looked long and deep, not like claw marks, but more like someone had dragged a metal object along the bark. Around midday, I smelled smoke. Not my fire. This was different, heavier, like wet wood burning. I stood still and tried to locate the source. The smell drifted and faded, then came back again. I moved slowly in the direction it seemed strongest. After about 20 minutes, I found a clearing I had not seen before. In the center was a small fire pit, still warm, with blackened stones around it. There were food wrappers scattered nearby and a piece of blue tarp tied loosely between two trees. Whoever had been there had left in a hurry. My heart was pounding now. I backed away quietly and returned to camp without following the trail any further. I considered leaving that day, but pride and stubbornness got the better of me. I told myself I was overreacting. Hunters cross paths all the time. I decided to stay one more night and leave in the morning. That night was the worst. Long after dark, I heard movement close to my tent. Slow steps in the leaves, circling. The sound came and went, stopping for long periods. I stayed still, barely breathing. My hand was on my rifle the whole time. I could hear someone breathing outside, deep and rough, not like an animal. The smell of smoke came again, stronger now, mixed with something sour and human. I did not sleep at all. Just before dawn, the footsteps moved away. I waited until full light before coming out of the tent. My camp was disturbed. The woodpile had been kicked apart. My pack had been moved a few feet from where I left it. Nothing was stolen, but that almost made it worse. Someone had been there, touching my things, knowing I was inside the tent. I packed up as fast as I could. My hands shook as I rolled the tent and stuffed it into my pack. Every sound made me jump. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see someone watching me. The hike back to the truck felt much longer than it had on the way in. I stopped often to listen. Once, I heard footsteps matching mine, stopping when I stopped. I did not turn around. I just kept going. When I reached the road, my truck was still there, untouched. I threw my gear into the bed and started the engine immediately. As I drove away, I checked the mirror constantly. I half expected to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. The forest swallowed the road behind me as I drove out. I reported what happened to a local ranger later that day. He listened quietly and took notes. He told me there had been problems in that area before. People living off the grid, illegal camps, drug activity. He said I did the right thing by leaving when I did. I have hunted many times since then, but I never camp alone anymore, and I never ignore that feeling when something feels off. That trip taught me something important. The woods do not need anything supernatural to be dangerous. All it takes is one person who should not be there, and a place far enough away that no one will hear you if something goes wrong. I went to the Amazon in late 2014 when I was 29 years old. I had been working seasonal contracts for conservation groups, mostly boring trail checks and wildlife camera maintenance. That year, I signed up to help a small park ranger unit that covered a protected section of rainforest near the border of northern Brazil. The job was simple on paper. Assist rangers during a search for a missing illegal miner who was believed to be dead somewhere deep in the forest. They wanted extra hands to cover ground, carry gear, and camp for weeks at a time. I told myself it was just another job. I was wrong. The place we were sent to was far from any village. The river was the only real way in or out. The forest there felt older than anything I had known. The trees were massive, thick with moss and vines, blocking most of the sunlight. Even at midday, it looked like late evening. The air was heavy and wet, and everything smelled like rot, mud, and green leaves. Bugs were everywhere. They crawled on skin, inside clothes, into ears and boots. You never really slept because something was always moving. We traveled by boat for hours before we reached the ranger base camp. It was nothing more than a few raised platforms made of old wood, covered with tarps and tin sheets. I set up my tent a little away from the others because I liked space. That decision would later feel like a mistake. At night, the jungle made constant noise. Frogs, insects, birds I had never seen. Some sounds were low and steady, others sharp and sudden. It never went quiet, not even for a second. The reason we were there was a dead man. Weeks earlier, locals had reported a strong smell near a remote stream. A helicopter had spotted disturbed ground, but the weather turned bad and no one could land. By the time we arrived, the body had likely been out there for a long time. The rangers wanted to locate it, document the scene, and remove anything illegal found nearby. That meant long walks through thick forest, cutting paths with machetes, and camping wherever night caught us. Each day we moved deeper. The ground was soft and uneven, full of roots and hidden holes. Sweat soaked everything. My hands were always wet. My pack felt heavier every hour. Sometimes we found old camps left by miners. Rusted cans, torn boots, broken tools. They felt abandoned in a rushed way, like people had left fast and never came back. That alone made me uneasy. On the fifth night, we set camp near a narrow stream. The water moved slowly and smelled bad. I could not explain why, but the area felt wrong. The forest was thicker there, and the air felt heavier. I pitched my tent on slightly higher ground, checking for snakes and ants before laying down my mat. I ate a small meal and tried to rest. Sleep came in pieces. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was not loud, but it was steady, something like slow movement through wet leaves. I lay still, listening. Animals moved at night, so I tried to stay calm. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I held my breath and waited. After a while, it faded into the normal jungle noise. I did not sleep much after that. The next morning, the smell hit me as soon as I unzipped my tent. It was strong and sour, like rotting meat mixed with stagnant water. The rangers noticed it too. We followed it carefully, moving downhill toward the stream. The smell got worse with every step. Flies buzzed thick in the air, landing on our faces and hands. We found the body about 30 meters from the water, tangled in roots at the base of a fallen tree. It had been there a long time. The skin was dark and swollen, clothes torn and partly eaten by insects. I will not go into graphic detail, but it was clear he had died slowly. There were signs of injury, maybe from a fall or infection. Around him were scattered items: a backpack, tools, empty fuel containers. Everything was logged and photographed. Even after we finished our work there, we had to stay in the area for 2 more nights. The weather turned bad, heavy rain falling nonstop. The stream rose fast, cutting off our planned route back. We were stuck. That second night after finding the body was the worst. The rain drowned out many jungle sounds, which somehow made things worse. My tent felt too thin, like it offered no protection at all. Around midnight, I heard movement again. This time it was clearer. Slow steps through mud and leaves. It circled the camp, not rushed, not careless. I could tell it was heavy, whatever it was. Not an animal like a deer or jaguar. It moved with uneven pauses, dragging slightly. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening to every detail. The steps came closer to my tent, then stopped. The smell from earlier returned, faint but noticeable, carried on the damp air. I felt sick. I told myself it was my imagination, leftover fear from seeing the body. After a long moment, the steps moved away. Nothing touched my tent. Nothing attacked. But I did not sleep again. The next morning, the ground around camp showed signs of disturbance. Mud pressed down in long, deep marks. Not clean footprints, but something dragged. No one said much. We packed up and waited for the water level to drop. When we finally left that area 2 days later, I felt relief, like I had escaped something watching me. Back at the ranger base, I washed myself for a long time, scrubbing until my skin burned. The smell still felt stuck in my nose. I finished the contract and left the Amazon shortly after. I never went back. Even now, years later, I remember that night clearly. The sound of slow steps in wet leaves, the heavy air, the feeling that death does not stay still in places like that. It settles into the land, mixes with the forest, and becomes part of it. The body was removed, the case closed, but something about that place felt unfinished. I know now that some jobs leave marks deeper than scars, and some places stay with you whether you want them to or not. I went camping near Farn Village in Northumberland in late October of 2016. I was 29 at the time and thought I knew the countryside well enough. I had walked and camped all over England before, mostly alone. I liked quiet places where nothing much happened. Farn was small, calm, and surrounded by open fields, low hills, and old stone walls that looked like they had been there forever. Felt harmless. I parked my car on a narrow lane not far from a patch of rough land I had scoped out weeks earlier. It was not a campsite, just a bit of land near the edge of a field with a thin line of trees behind it. The farmer's field stretched out on one side, and beyond the trees was a shallow dip in the land that led toward marshy ground. The air smelled of wet grass and soil. The sky was gray, heavy, and low. I carried my gear in 2 trips. The ground was uneven and soft from recent rain. My boots sank slightly with every step. I set my tent near the trees to block some of the wind. The trees were thin and bent, shaped by years of strong weather. Their branches creaked and rubbed against each other even when the wind was light. I noticed how quiet everything else was. No birds, no distant traffic, nothing. Just wind and the sound of fabric as I worked. By the time I finished setting up, the light was already fading. Autumn days end early that far north. I made a simple meal on my small stove and ate sitting on a flat rock. The food tasted fine, but I felt tense for no clear reason. I kept looking toward the trees and then across the open field. Nothing moved, yet I had the feeling of being exposed. As it got darker, the temperature dropped fast. Moist cold crept into my clothes. I packed everything away neatly and climbed into the tent. I did not start a fire. I did not want the attention. That thought surprised me when it came to mind, because I could not explain what attention I was worried about. The night settled in thick and black. Clouds covered the sky, blocking moonlight. The field disappeared into darkness. The wind picked up and ran across the grass in waves. I lay on my back, listening. The tent fabric snapped now and then. Leaves scraped against the outer wall. Somewhere in the distance, something heavy moved through the wet ground. Could have been livestock or deer, but it sounded slow and deliberate. I tried to sleep, but my mind stayed sharp. Every sound felt close. At some point, I heard footsteps. They were not fast. They pressed into the ground with weight, then lifted, then pressed again. They did not come closer to the tent. They moved along the edge of the trees and then stopped. I held my breath without meaning to. The sound did not repeat. After a long time, the wind covered everything again. Later in the night, rain started. It was light at first, then steady. Water ran down the tent walls and soaked into the ground. I checked my phone for the time. Just after 1 in the morning. No signal. I put the phone away and closed my eyes again. That was when I smelled smoke. It was faint, like damp would burned badly, not a clean fire. I sat up slowly. I did not hear a fire. I did not see any light through the tent fabric. The smell came and went, carried by the wind. I told myself it could be a farmhouse miles away. Still, my chest felt tight. I stayed awake until the rain eased near dawn. When the light finally came, it was weak and flat. The field looked dull and colorless. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground around me was marked with deep footprints. Not mine. They were larger and pressed hard into the mud. They circled the tent once, then led toward the trees. I stood there a long time, staring. The prints were fresh. Rain had softened their edges, but they were clear enough. Someone had walked around my tent in the night. Slowly, carefully, I packed up quickly. I did not eat. I did not take my time. I loaded my pack and followed the lane back to the car. I told myself I was overreacting, that it could have been a farmer checking land. But the lane was empty, and no houses were close enough for that to make sense. Instead of leaving, I drove into Farn Village itself. I wanted daylight and other people nearby. I parked near the church and walked around for a while. The village was quiet but normal. Stone cottages, narrow roads, a small green. Nothing felt wrong there. After an hour, my nerves settled. I convinced myself the fear came from being alone and tired. I decided to camp one more night, but in a different spot. I drove a few miles away to higher ground with a better view and less cover nearby. I found a place near an old ruined wall, far from trees. The land sloped gently, and I could see for a long distance in every direction. That made me feel safer. I set up again, slower this time, paying attention to everything. The sky cleared a little in the afternoon. Pale sunlight broke through. I ate properly and drank water. I even felt foolish for being scared the night before. Night came again, colder this time. The wind was stronger up on the hill, steady and loud, pushed against the tent without pause. I lay inside, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the constant sound. It made other noises harder to notice, which bothered me more than silence. Sometime after midnight, the wind dropped suddenly. The quiet was sharp. I heard breathing outside the tent. It was low and rough, not fast. It stayed close to the ground. I froze. I did not move a muscle. The breathing shifted position, moving from one side of the tent to the other. Fabric brushed lightly, as if touched. The wall of the tent pressed inward for a moment and then released. I waited for an animal sound, a snort, a shuffle, anything that would make it make sense. Nothing came. The breathing stopped. I listened until my ears hurt. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then footsteps moved away, heading downhill. I did not sleep again. When morning came, the sky was clear and bright. Frost covered the grass. Around the tent were more footprints. They were clearer this time. Bootprints. Worn soles. Someone had stood close enough to touch the tent and then walked away slowly. I packed up with shaking hands. I did not explore. I did not take photos. I drove straight back toward the main road and did not stop until I reached a busy town with shops and traffic and noise. I never camped near Farn again. I never camped alone in that kind of open rural land after that. Nothing attacked me. Nothing dramatic happened. But someone was there twice in the dark, watching without being seen. That knowledge stayed with me longer than any story about ghosts ever could. I learned that real fear does not need explanations. It only needs proof that someone else was close enough to breathe beside your shelter while you slept and chose not to be seen. I went camping alone in late September of 2014 when I was 27. I picked a small, overlooked national forest in northern Idaho, not one of the popular parks. It was the kind of place people skipped because there were no big views or lakes for photos. Just miles of pine trees, uneven dirt roads, and old campsites that looked like they had not been used in years. That was exactly why I chose it. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel cut off for a few days. I drove my old pickup down a narrow forest road until my phone lost signal completely. The road had deep tire ruts filled with dry leaves and small rocks. Branches scraped along the sides of my truck. I finally reached a small clearing with a fire ring made of blackened stones and a rotting wooden picnic table. No other cars were around. The place smelled like damp soil and pine sap. The air felt heavy and still, like the forest was holding its breath. I set up my tent slowly, taking my time. The ground was uneven, so I had to clear sticks and pine cones with my boot. Every sound felt loud. Birds moving in the trees, wind brushing through the needles, the distant cracking sound of wood shifting as it cooled. I remember thinking how alone I really was. That thought felt good at first. As the sun dropped lower, the forest grew darker fast. Shadows stretched between the trees, thick and deep. I cooked a simple meal over my small stove and ate sitting on a log. I noticed then how quiet it had become. No birds anymore, no insects, just the wind, slow and steady. That silence made me uneasy, but I told myself I was just not used to being alone like this. I decided to take a short walk before it got fully dark. I left my campsite and followed a faint trail that led deeper into the trees. The ground dipped and rose, roots breaking through the soil like twisted fingers. About 10 minutes in, I saw something that made me stop. Footprints, fresh ones. The dirt was pressed down clearly, not covered by leaves yet. They were boot prints larger than mine. My first thought was that someone else was camping nearby. That was not strange on its own, but it bothered me because I had seen no vehicles and no other campsites on the way in. I stood there for a long moment listening. I heard nothing, no movement, no voices, just the wind again. I walked back to my campsite faster than before. The sky was turning purple and orange through the trees. I locked my truck, even though it felt silly, and made sure everything was where I left it. Nothing looked disturbed. Still, I felt watched. That feeling stuck to me like a cold layer on my skin. Night came fully, and the forest changed. The darkness felt thick, like it pressed in from all sides. My headlamp lit only a small circle around me. Everything beyond that was just black shapes. I sat by a small fire, trying to relax, but I kept scanning the trees. That was when I saw movement. At first, I thought it was an animal. A deer, maybe. Something tall passed between two trees at the edge of my firelight. I froze. I waited for it to move again. A few seconds passed, then I saw it more clearly. It was a man. He stood just beyond the light, far enough that his face stayed hidden in shadow. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and what looked like a hood or hat pulled low. He did not move toward me. He did not move away either. He just stood there, slightly hunched, like he was listening. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed still, hoping he had not seen me yet, even though the fire made that impossible. After a long moment, he stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I sat there for a long time after that, barely breathing. My mind tried to explain it away. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he was just passing through. Still, none of those thoughts made me feel better. I put out the fire and went into my tent, zipping it shut as quietly as possible. Inside the tent, every sound felt 10 times louder. Leaves shifting, branches creaking, my own breathing. I lay there with my flashlight in my hand, staring at the thin fabric wall. Hours seemed to pass. Just when I thought I might fall asleep, I heard footsteps. They were slow and careful, circling my campsite. I could hear the crunch of dirt and leaves, then silence, then another step. Whoever it was knew how to move quietly, but not quietly enough. The steps came closer to my tent, then stopped right outside. I saw a shadow block the faint moonlight through the fabric. The shape was tall, too tall to be a child or an animal. The shadow leaned slightly, as if the person was bending down to look at the tent. I held my breath, afraid even the sound of air leaving my lungs would give me away. The shadow stayed there for a long time. Then it moved away slowly. The footsteps faded back into the trees. I did not sleep after that. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten. When morning came, I forced myself out of the tent. The campsite looked normal, almost peaceful. Birds were back. Sunlight filtered through the trees. If not for the marks in the dirt around my tent, I might have thought I imagined everything. There were footprints all around the campsite, the same boot prints from before. One set came right up to my tent and stopped. I packed as fast as I could, my hands shaking. As I loaded my truck, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. On the picnic table, carved deep into the wood, were fresh marks. Long lines cut into the surface, messy and uneven, like someone had dragged a knife across it again and again. I got into my truck and started driving out immediately. About halfway back down the forest road, I saw him again. He stood off to the side of the road, partly hidden by trees. In daylight, I could see him more clearly. He was older than I thought, maybe late 40s or 50s. His face was thin, his skin pale and rough. His eyes followed my truck as I passed, completely still. I did not slow down. I did not look back. When I finally reached a place with cell signal, I pulled over and sat there for a long time trying to calm down. I never reported it. I had no proof, no pictures, nothing but fear and memories. But I know what I saw. I know how real it felt. I have camped since then, but never alone, and never in places that empty. Sometimes at night, when I hear footsteps outside my tent, my mind goes right back to that forest. Back to that man standing just beyond the firelight, watching, waiting, and knowing exactly how alone I was. I went camping alone in the late fall of 2014, somewhere in the northern part of Idaho, not far from the Canadian line, but still deep in the United States. I was 34 years old at the time and had been camping most of my life. I worked a boring warehouse job and used weekends to disappear into the woods. I picked a spot that was marked on an old Forest Service map, a faded square that meant a primitive campsite near a river bend. No cell service, no nearby towns, just miles of trees and dirt roads. The drive-in already felt wrong. The gravel road narrowed more than I remembered, and branches scraped the sides of my truck for miles. Fallen leaves covered everything, hiding ruts and sharp rocks. I passed an abandoned logging trailer with broken windows and a rusted chainsaw sitting in the dirt beside it. That should have been my first warning, but I kept going because I had already driven 4 hours and didn't want to turn back. I reached the campsite in the afternoon. It was colder than expected, the kind of cold that sits in your chest when you breathe. The river was lower than normal, moving slow and dark, with dead leaves floating on the surface. The campsite itself looked untouched for a long time. The fire ring was half collapsed and filled with wet pine needles. There were no fresh tire tracks, no footprints, nothing that showed anyone had been there recently. I set up my tent close to the tree line instead of the open clearing. I don't know why, but I didn't like the feeling of being exposed. The woods were quiet in a heavy way. No birds, no wind, just the low sound of the river. Every noise I made felt loud and out of place. Even snapping small branches for firewood sounded sharp, like breaking bones. As the sun dropped, the temperature fell fast. I cooked a simple meal and sat on a log, staring into the fire. The light from the flames barely reached past a few feet. Everything beyond that was pure black. The trees formed a solid wall, tall and close together, blocking the sky. When the fire popped or shifted, Shadows jumped in strange ways that made my stomach tighten. That night, I crawled into my sleeping bag early. The cold crept in no matter how much I layered up. I lay there listening to the woods. At first, it was normal sounds. The river moving, leaves shifting, something small moving through the brush. But around midnight, something changed. The forest went completely still. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It felt empty, like the woods were holding their breath. I became aware of how loud my own breathing was. I slowed it down, trying not to make noise. That was when I heard footsteps. They were slow and heavy, not like a deer or elk. Each step had weight to it, crunching leaves, snapping small twigs. Whatever it wasn't trying to be quiet. The steps circled the campsite, staying just beyond the reach of my fire's dying embers. I lay frozen, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, waiting to see a shadow pass by. The steps stopped near the back of my tent. I could hear breathing, low and rough, close enough that I could feel it through the ground. The smell came next. It was a mix of sweat, dirt, and something rotten, like old meat. I pulled my knife closer, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip it with both hands to keep it still. After a long time, the steps moved away. I didn't sleep at all after that. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten, my muscles sore from being locked in place for hours. Morning didn't make things better. The campsite looked different in daylight. There were fresh footprints in the dirt near the fire ring. Boot prints, large and deep, not mine. They circled my tent. Near the tree line, I found crushed grass and a spot where someone had stood for a long time. I could tell by the way the ground was pressed down. I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through, maybe someone camping nearby, but I hadn't seen any vehicles, and the prints led away from the campsite into thick brush, not toward the road. I packed up quickly but decided to stay one more night because the drive out was long and my nerves felt too raw to handle it right away. That afternoon, I explored a bit, hoping to calm myself down. Less than a mile from my camp, I found something that made my stomach drop. An old tarp stretched between trees, sagging and torn. Under it were empty food cans, stained clothing, and a pile of bones that looked like they came from small animals. There was also a shallow hole in the ground, dug with bare hands or a crude tool. This wasn't a normal camp. It felt lived in, not temporarily, but in a desperate way. Someone had been staying there for a long time. I felt like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. I went back to my campsite before dark. I built a larger fire and kept it going, feeding it constantly. Night came faster than I expected. The cold was worse than the night before, biting through my clothes. The fire was the only thing that made the world feel real. The footsteps came again earlier this time. They approached from the same direction, slow and steady. I stayed inside the tent, watching the shadows move across the fabric. The smell returned, stronger now. I heard something brush against the side of the tent, then fingers pressing lightly against the material, testing it. The pressure stopped, then started again near the zipper. My heart felt like it was trying to tear out of my chest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited. After a long time, the fingers pulled away. The footsteps moved toward the river and faded. I stayed in the tent until the sun came up again. At first light, I noticed my food bag was gone. Not torn open, not scattered, gone completely. Whoever had been there knew exactly what they were doing. That was enough. I packed everything I could as fast as I could. I didn't bother cleaning up. I left the fire ring as it was and shoved my gear into the truck. As I drove out, I noticed something that chilled me more than anything else. Fresh branches had been placed across the road behind my truck, like someone had tried to block it after I arrived. I didn't stop driving. I didn't slow down. I didn't even look back. When I reached the paved highway hours later, my hands were numb from gripping the steering wheel. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported what I had seen. They listened, took notes, and nodded, but their faces stayed neutral. One of them mentioned that there had been reports of people living illegally in remote areas, avoiding towns and roads, people who didn't want to be found. I never heard back from them. No follow-up, no questions. Months later, I read a small local news article about a man being arrested near that same stretch of forest. He had been living off the land for years, stealing supplies from campsites and breaking into cabins during the off-season. The article mentioned animal remains, stolen food, and signs that he had been watching people for long periods before approaching. I stopped camping alone after that. Even now, years later, I still think about how close he was while I lay in that tent, how thin the fabric was, how easily things could have gone differently. The woods didn't feel haunted. They felt occupied, and that somehow felt much worse.